The countryside had never looked kinder than it did in 1843, when the Renshaw Asylum first opened its doors. Nestled behind hedgerows and flanked by willows that bowed like reverent monks, it was hailed as a humane answer to the madness that plagued England's poor. A gift, they said, from the Duke of Sussex himself. Cousin to Queen Victoria and once a man known for his progressive sympathy toward the mentally afflicted. Renshaw's red brick walls were softened by ivy, its windows wide and unscreened, and the iron gate out front swung easily, creaking in the breeze like a chapel door inviting lost souls home. It was a place built not for punishment but for retreat. Inside, the walls were painted soft green. The beds were made of white iron and pressed linen. The chapel chimed 3 times daily, and visitors said it smelled of starch, soap, and something medicinal like hope steeped in alcohol. And in those early days, it worked. Men and women arrived shrieking and left muttering hymns. Farmers bowed their heads in thanks. Even the vicar blessed the grounds. But the change came slow, so slow it could almost be mistaken for progress. It began with Dr. Elias Fenn, a young man from Edinburgh with clear skin, a soft voice, and letters of praise from Sir James Simpson himself. Fenn introduced new terms: voluntary catharsis, delusion suppression, obedience therapy. His manner was kind, his words were measured, and when he asked to relocate the more troubled patients to the Eastern Wing, none questioned it. He said it was quieter there, said the structure was more isolated, better suited for those who needed silence to heal. A small change, necessary, temporary. But silence in Renshaw soon became a kind of infection. The laughter stopped, the humming ceased. The nurses, once instructed to sing hymns as they worked, now wore heavier shoes and walked without song. Even the chapel bell fell quiet. Its rope mysteriously snapped during a thunderless night never replaced. Visitors dwindled, reports thinned. The poor still came, but they no longer left. By 1846, the outer gate creaked no longer. It had been oiled, reinforced, and chained shut from the outside, not to trap anyone in, Fenn insisted, but to keep dangers out. He referenced a riot at Bethlehem Hospital, though it hadn't made the papers. He spoke of protectiveness, of safety, of ensuring those inside were undisturbed in their recovery. But what recovered inside Renshaw grew dark. The Eastern Wing had no windows now, and the lamps burned longer there than anywhere else. Some nights a low mechanical hum pulsed through the corridors, like wheels turning beneath the floorboards, like air being pressed into lungs that had not asked to breathe. No one saw where the power came from. No one asked. Fenn kept no assistants. No nurses entered without his summons. Even the groundskeepers were forbidden to trim the hedges near the wing's rear wall. The locks changed. The blueprints vanished. And still the poor were delivered there by wagon, labeled by parish priests as melancholic, nervous, or simply unfit for the world. A boy was taken in winter. Henry, aged 11, who'd been found talking to mud puddles behind his mother's shop. A woman followed that spring, Marion, whose hands trembled too violently for her to keep her job at the textile mill. A brother and sister came the year after, neither older than 16, both prone to dreams that made them scream themselves hoarse. They were not dangerous, they were not violent, they were not criminal, but they were inconvenient. Fenn took them all. With clean fingernails and a calm voice, he labeled their minds unwell and promised rest. By 1849, Renshaw's facade remained unblemished. The outer gardens were still weeded, the chapel still stood, though empty, and the guest wing still received the rare curate or bishop who passed through. But the eastern wing smelled of wax and rot, of metal, of something scorched but never extinguished. The linen there had turned gray. The lamps flickered even when filled with fresh oil. And from the third floor, just beyond where the blueprints ended, came faint rhythmic thuds, like kneeling, like bodies folding, like rituals no one had spoken aloud. Still no one asked, no one filed reports. Because Fenn sent regular letters to the ministry, detailing recoveries and moral improvements. Because his language was professional. Because his handwriting was beautiful. It was that same year, 1849, when the last visiting mother was turned away. Her name was Clara. She had come to see her son committed by a pastor for episodes of divine grief. She was told he could not see visitors. She begged. She showed his birth certificate. A nurse wept silently and walked away. Clara was never seen again on the grounds, though her coat was later found in the hedge by the eastern wall. Buttons torn, pockets empty, fabric stained with something dark that smelled of copper and lavender. After that, the gates were not only locked, they were watched. 2 parish constables took shifts outside. A second lock was installed. The sign was repainted. Renshaw Home for the Melancholy Poor. Visits by invitation only. No one remembered when the word asylum had been painted over. It wasn't clear who ordered it, but it remained gone. By winter, even the snow avoided the grounds. It melted before touching the slate roof. The birds that once perched on the chapel cross had vanished. And in the eastern wing, beneath 3 floors and a sealed stairwell, a furnace burned steadily, though no one delivered coal. The only visible light came from a slot the size of a book, briefly opened each dawn, then sealed again. No one remembered when the deliveries stopped. No one recalled the names of those who entered, but the smoke never stopped, the records never matched, and the gate that once swung open now groaned under, chains thicker than memory. Renshaw had become what it was never built to be, not a refuge but a vault, not to heal but to hold. And what it held, no one would dare name, not yet, not aloud, not until someone finally noticed that every death record bore a date, but not a grave. He arrived in spring. The sky had just begun to warm, and the crocuses outside Renshaw were starting to split open like small, naive mouths. Dr. Elias Fenn carried nothing but a single trunk, a bound leather folio and a handwritten letter of endorsement from Sir James Simpson, the man who had once coaxed silence from the screaming with a rag soaked in chloroform. But Fenn did not believe in rags. He did not believe in sleep. He believed in silence, yes, but the kind that remained even after a patient had opened their mouth. A silence that came from somewhere deeper. He wore white gloves his first day, even though there was no patient contact. He wore them his second day as well. On the third, he took them off only to shake hands with the rector overseeing the chapel wing, then slipped them back on with care. The nurses whispered that he smelled of salt water and iron, not filth, but metal, sharp and polished. When he moved, his feet made no sound. The Duke of Sussex, aging and increasingly reclusive, had funded Renshaw as a place of reform and mercy. But mercy does not write books. Elias Fenn intended to write something lasting. His folio contained diagrams. Sketches of the brain drawn in obsessive detail, lines converging at the amygdala, the hippocampus, and regions labeled not with scientific names but with phrases like submission center and vault of impulse. He had developed his own theory after observing soldiers returned from the Afghan campaign. He believed obedience was not learned but wired, that the mind could be cauterized like a wound, its defiant edges burned clean until only compliance remained. But to test this, he needed something war could not offer: a controlled environment. No bullets, no noise, no bloodshed to blame. Just a body, a mind, and time. Renshaw offered all three. Within weeks, he submitted new treatment protocols. They used the word therapy, but therapy implies healing. Fenn's methods did not aim to return patients to society. They aimed to strip away the very parts that resisted it. He called his first design the suppression chamber. A room with no corners. The ceiling sloped inward. The floor was cushioned with thin horsehair and lined with grooves to catch waste. There were no beds, no lights. The patient was placed inside for 12 hours without sound, without objects, without the ability to scream and hear themselves. Then, after 12 hours of silence, Fenn would play them a single voice. Sometimes his, sometimes a mother's, sometimes the recording of another patient sobbing. These voices were repeated. One sentence, played over and over until the patient mouthed it back. Some took a day. Others broke within the hour. One boy, Joseph B., age 14, lasted 6. When he emerged, he could no longer blink without trembling. His file was stamped calmed. He was never seen again. Fenn's obsession grew quieter as it grew sharper. He requested a glass-walled room, hidden inside the eastern wing. Inside, he tested response to visual repetition. Images of pain, fire, children in poses of begging, mothers with hollow eyes. Some of the images were real. Others he drew himself. He found that showing these to patients while administering starvation, then suddenly feeding them in bursts of warm milk, caused an emotional tethering to the most violent image on the wall. In later trials, patients who had been shown fire would press their hands to hot coals and weep with relief. Fenn noted this with careful precision. They seek their wound to understand their shape, he wrote. Pain defines borders. Borders define belonging. By autumn, no one referred to him as a doctor. They called him Director Fenn. The chapel was emptied, the confessional turned into a records room. The cross was removed under the excuse of wood rot, and in its place Fenn had hung a circular brass disc etched with what he called a harmonic symbol. It bore no words, only lines that intersected in harsh mathematical arcs. He claimed it calmed agitation. In reality, it cast a shadow that never aligned with the sun. He never raised his voice, never hit a patient, never committed violence with his own hands. But he ordered men strapped to inclined slabs placed in silence and fed only when they uttered specific scripted words. Those who resisted were not punished. They were ignored. Neglect was the sharpest of his tools. One woman, Eleanor, 32, was told she would not be fed until she recited her wedding vows backward. When she finally spoke, the words came out garbled, frantic. She died 2 days later of aspiration during a feeding trial. Fenn recorded it as emotional arrhythmia. The nurse who found her was reassigned to furnace duty. The staff were never given explanations, only new assignments. And slowly, even the nurses began to behave differently. They stepped lighter, avoided eye contact, Some began mimicking his cadence when speaking. The oldest nurse, Margaret, left without notice. Her room was found swept clean. The sheets on her bed were folded in perfect thirds. Her shoes remained at the foot of the bed, soles polished, heels aligned. Her name was struck from the employment rolls before the month's end. Fenn believed resistance was not moral, it was chemical. That once the mind was cleaned of noetic clutter, as he called it, patients could be made to accept any reality. He tested this by rotating names. A patient named Martha would be called Ellen for a week, then Beatrice, then Ruth. The staff were instructed to use only the new name. If the patient hesitated or corrected them, she was isolated. Eventually, many of them stopped using their own names altogether. They pointed at themselves and waited. Fenn believed this proved his theory. That identity was merely an echo waiting to be overwritten. The more echoes he erased, the more silent the halls became. He called that progress. And yet every evening Fenn washed his hands in scalding water and applied lavender oil to his skin. He kept his nails short, filed daily. No dirt, no marks, no tremor. Evil like his did not stain. It polished, it refined. And beneath the smell of lavender and starch, something else began to grow. Not rot, but reverence. Because to those around him he did not seem monstrous, he seemed precise, clean, controlled. The kind of man you'd trust with your child if they screamed too much. And maybe that was the worst part of it. Not that he harmed, but that he did so without raising a single bruise, and called it medicine. Eliza was not a loud girl. She hadn't spoken in years, not since her father died in the fire that left her mother unable to blink without sobbing. They said the girl was simple, perhaps touched by fever as a child, perhaps just quiet. Her silence did not worry the parish, but it did inconvenience them. Her mother could not afford her care, and the town vicar described her as spiritually dormant. That was enough. In 1849, she arrived at Renshaw Asylum with a woven bonnet, 2 cracked shoes, and a note that read only, Eliza W., age 12, mute, prone to rocking. She was placed in the eastern wing where the hallways no longer echoed, and where silence, as Dr. Fenn believed, was never the absence of noise, only the beginning of obedience. Fenn had grown interested in cases like hers, not for compassion but for the challenge. Eliza was a blank canvas, one that resisted without words, one whose disobedience was not shouted but implied. She did not cry. She did not beg. She simply stared. Her eyes, wide and dark, tracked movement with eerie steadiness. She did not flinch when others were pulled from their rooms at night. She did not cower at the rattle of the pulley cage in the far wing. Her stillness irritated him. He documented this irritation clinically, as though describing a weather pattern. He wrote, "Nonverbal resistance harder to override, psychological rooting too deep, requires new method, one that bypasses language and targets submission at origin." He did not clarify what origin meant, but the day after that entry, Eliza was taken to the mirror ward. The mirror ward was not reflective in the traditional sense. It had no glass, no polished silver. Instead, its name came from its purpose: to force a patient to see themselves the way the institution saw them. To break the mind not with violence, but with repeated confrontation of itself. Eliza was strapped upright, her feet hovering just above the floor so that her legs trembled from the effort of pretending to stand. A narrow cylinder. No, wider than a stovepipe, surrounded her face from chin to brow. At the center of the tube was a pinhole of flickering light, just enough to reveal her own expression. Not to reflect beauty, but to reveal fear. For 20 hours she was left there. The nurses were told to administer drops of water and 2 spoonfuls of broth at intervals marked by a brass pendulum. She did not swallow. She only stared into the light. Fenn watched the recordings. Each flicker in her gaze, each twitch of her lip he noted with fascination. She did not weep. She did not scream. But something behind her eyes had begun to unravel. He called this progress. On the 3rd day, she was returned to her cell. The room was different now. She was greeted by a nurse who called her Mary. Her bedding was blue instead of white. The smell of the room was changed, lavender replaced by salt. When Eliza refused to eat, her meals were replaced with a chalky mixture called obedience milk, warm, thick, and flavored faintly of licorice and iron. She swallowed it only once. That night she began biting her fingers, not drawing blood, not with rage, but with a strange mechanical rhythm, as though she were counting. The next morning her hands were bound. Fenn reviewed her case for his report to the ministry. He noted severe oral fixation, possibly spiritual in nature. He theorized that the mind, when denied expressive outlets, would turn inward and devour itself metaphorically. He saw in Eliza a perfect opportunity to make that metaphor real. And so he ordered the trial. It was called reflection reversal. The subject would be exposed to the sound of their own breathing, slowed and reversed, played through a copper tube aimed directly at the skull. Beneath this noise, a low chant was layered, a Latin phrase derived from medieval penance rituals, 1 syllable at a time, repeated over hours. Eliza was restrained with padded bands across the jaw, but not the mouth. Her head was tilted back at a precise 30-degree angle. Her tongue remained untouched. When the nurse entered the chamber hours later, the girl was unconscious. Her body sagged against the bindings. Her eyes were open but unseeing. Blood pooled at her collarbone. Her teeth had shattered inward, all of them. Not broken by force, not cracked from heat. Each one crushed slowly, methodically, like clay pressed between jaw and bone. Fenn called it a self-inflicted injury caused by cognitive discord between obedience center and spiritual memory. He wrote that the girl had bitten herself in confusion, as if she had attacked herself out of theological error. He did not mention the audio device. He did not mention the chant. He simply recorded her as the first loss of the program and submitted her death under the label neurological collapse. There was no funeral, no burial. Her body was placed in the facility's burn room, though the flames that week had been unusually low. The ashes were never confirmed. The nurses were told she had returned home, and her name was erased from the ledger by hand. Not struck through, not crossed out, but gently removed with a heated knife and re-inked with a different patient's name in its place. A trick Fenn had learned from monastic record keepers centuries before. That silence, when crafted properly, could rewrite memory itself. Eliza's room was cleaned within the hour. Her sheets burned, her shoes placed back in the donation box. And yet, that evening, one nurse, a woman named Ruth, claimed to hear a sound outside the mirror ward. A faint clicking, not footsteps, not voices, just the sound of teeth echoing against tile. She was dismissed for hysteria the following week. Her journal was never found, but her last entry scratched into the underside of her bed frame read, "She never had to speak. He just wanted her quiet in his own way." Henry had come to Renshaw from a charity home in Norwich after being deemed unfit for apprentice labor. He was 17 but looked younger, thin wrists, soft jaw, eyes that moved too quickly between shadows. His records described him as impulsive, emotionally unstable, and tactile fixated. In truth, he had been beaten for touching the leather tools at a cobbler's bench and slapped for cradling a kitten's body after it had been run over in the street. The world found his sensitivity unbearable, and Renshaw, as always, was where the unbearable were sent to vanish quietly. Dr. Elias Fenn reviewed Henry's intake form and saw potential. A boy so responsive to sensation, so hungry for contact, could be rewired. Not by denying sensation, but by controlling how and when it was delivered. Fenn had begun exploring new concepts in sensory submission, not through starvation or silence this time, but through heat. He called it thermal obedience. The eastern wing had an old laundry room long unused where copper piping still ran behind the walls. Fenn cleared it of linen and replaced it with a small platform, slanted at an angle with wrist and ankle cuffs padded in stiff wool. Above the platform, suspended by iron arms, hung a brass vessel once used to melt soap blocks. Fenn replaced it with beeswax, natural, unscented, thick, slow to cool. He wanted it to coat but not burn. The wax would be dripped from a calculated height, heated to a precise temperature, and timed to fall at intervals long enough to prevent nerve collapse but short enough to prevent the body from adjusting. Around the chamber he arranged 4 old church bell casings, hollowed, cracked from age, but still able to echo. Inside each bell a funnel system was placed to trap and magnify sound. The room was renamed the Harmonic Chamber, but nothing inside it produced harmony. Henry was chosen for the trial because he flinched when touched and cried when ignored, a contradiction that fascinated Fenn. On the first day, the boy was stripped from the waist down and strapped to the slanted slab. His legs were trembling before anything began. Fenn recorded his breathing patterns, noted the initial spike in heart rate, then started the procedure. 1 drop of wax every 40 seconds. First on the thigh, then the shin, then the top of the foot. Each impact made a wet thud, and each thud echoed back through the bell casings, amplified a dozen times, bouncing around the boy like voices arguing in a cathedral. After each drop, silence returned, but never for long enough. Henry sobbed in confusion. He begged to know what he had done wrong. Fenn stood behind the glass, taking notes with steady hands. He was not measuring pain. He was measuring surrender. By the second hour, Henry no longer screamed. He only whimpered and shuddered when the wax hit, as if his body expected it and resented itself for knowing. The floor beneath him was slick with melted wax and urine. The bells around him shifted slightly as the air grew warmer, their metal expanding with the heat, causing soft pings that sounded like breath held too long. Fenn increased the drop interval to 30 seconds, then 20, then 15. Henry's muscles began to seize, his feet twitching even before the wax landed. The mind, Fenn noted, was now reacting to time itself. Pain was no longer tied to touch. It was tethered to rhythm, to expectation. This, to Fenn, was the ultimate goal, to make the body flinch before harm, to train the brain to obey the clock, not the hand. He called it anticipatory obedience, and it worked. After 4 hours, Henry lost consciousness. His legs were encased in wax up to the hip. Not burned, but covered, a smooth, opaque shell that held the skin like a funeral mask. When the nurses unstrapped him, the shell cracked in several places, leaving lines that looked like deep, angry veins. The boy was cleaned and placed in a recovery cot, his legs wrapped in linen soaked in vinegar to draw out the heat. He did not speak. He did not blink. He only looked at the ceiling with wide, glassy eyes. That night, when a nurse passed by his door, she heard a faint ticking sound. She stepped closer and realized it came from his mouth. He was clicking his tongue against the roof, slow and steady, exactly every 15 seconds. Fenn was thrilled. He declared the experiment a success and submitted a paper to a private medical board under a pseudonym. Not to hide, but to protect the purity of the research from what he called sentimental interference. He wrote that the body could be made to worship rhythm, that pain, if repeated in measured sequence, became sacred. He likened the wax dripping to religious incantation, compared the bells to rosary chains. Suffering in this context became holy, and holiness bred submission. Henry became the model for further trials. He no longer responded to his name. He only moved when the metronome in his cell clicked. His legs, though healing, developed boils where the wax had sealed too tight. Fenn ordered them left alone. "Wounds must be remembered," he wrote. "If the body forgets, the spirit wanders." The psychological toll on the others was immediate. Patients began flinching at sudden temperature changes. One girl tried to swallow a candle stub during chapel hour. Another wrapped her legs in damp sheets, terrified of warmth. The bell casings, even when not in use, created echoes that crawled through the east wing like the memory of thunder. Staff reported migraines. One nurse was found stuffing cotton into her ears and muttering about the sound of dripping that never stopped. She was reassigned to kitchen duty. The wax vessel remained suspended, cleaned daily, even when not in use. Fenn insisted it stay full, not because he needed it, but because the fear it created saved him time. Patients who heard it filled themselves with silence. When Henry finally spoke again, it was not with meaning. He simply muttered the numbers 15, 15, 15 over and over until his tongue dried and cracked. Fenn listened once, then never again. To him, the boy was complete, a tool finished, a mind cracked open and poured into a mold. Wax skin, hollow bells, and a heartbeat taught to obey the drop instead of the hand. By 1851, the eastern wing of Renshaw no longer housed patients. It held examples. That's how Dr. Fenn referred to them in his private journals. Not men and women, not names or souls, but bodies molded into proof. Proof that the human will could be undone by precision and ritual. Proof that suffering, when delivered with meaning, did more than break. It shaped. It elevated. He had grown impatient with passive obedience, with silence, with flinching. He wanted confession, not spoken through mouths which could lie, but through the skin, the body's own parchment. And so he began a program he called scripture binding. It was not recorded in the asylum's official ledgers. Its name never left the walls. But survivors whispered about it in the years that followed, and the marks they carried could not be denied. The first patient chosen was a woman named Judith. She was 37, sent to Renshaw after refusing to speak during her husband's funeral. Her silence was interpreted as derangement. In truth, she had watched her husband die choking on his own words and wanted nothing more to do with speech. Fenn found her perfect. He met with her once, noted her stillness, and marked her chart with a symbol, not a word, just a curled line like a fishhook bent inward. She was taken that evening to the chapel infirmary, which had been stripped of its altar and fitted with a long wooden table slightly curved to fit the spine. A nurse, hand-picked by Fenn, shaved the skin of Judith's back with a bone-dull razor, removing only the top layer. Then came the linen, thin strips soaked in vinegar cut from the hems of discarded gowns. Onto these Fenn had stitched segments of the Book of Job, not with ink but with wax thread, stained with rust from the bell casings used in the harmonic chamber. The thread was deliberately coarse. The words long. Each verse was pressed into the skin not by glue or salve but by fine surgical needles. One stitch for each letter, 32 stitches per verse, 84 verses per session. He believed that pain engraved the spirit, that scripture, when forced into the body, bypassed moral resistance and seeded deeper truths. He did not pray. He did not kneel. But he believed in ritual, his own kind, forged from anatomy, timing, and the slow erosion of resistance. Judith was kept bound for 3 days. She was permitted no mirror, no sound, and no motion except the slow rise of her breath. Nurses were instructed to recite the stitched verses aloud as they cleaned her wounds. The thread was not removed. The body was expected to heal around it. When Judith was returned to her cell, her eyes no longer held shape. She stared at the floor, lips pressed into a silent line, as if every word had been pulled from her mouth and sewn into her spine. The next morning she was found kneeling, rocking gently, reciting Job 13:23. Not aloud, but through clenched teeth, like a spell she could no longer swallow. Her chart was updated with one word: purged. Others followed. Men and women alike selected for defiance, resistance, or simply confusion. Some were sown with psalms, others with excerpts from Leviticus. Fenn experimented with spacing, font size, thread tension. One man, George M., had a single verse, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," wrapped in spirals around his torso, punctuated with tiny brass pins to ensure skin separation. The infection that followed was expected. The fever, welcome. As Fenn wrote in his notes, a burning body becomes a holy one. Contamination proves the scripture entered the blood. George survived, but barely. His skin peeled in ribbons. When he spoke again, he whispered verses to the walls, not to people. The Bishop of Ely visited once during a quiet month when the upper wings had been staged to appear calm. Fenn greeted him in pressed black and white, his hands gloved, his tone polite. He explained the binding doctrine as a private form of repentance, deeply rooted in medieval monastic correction. He showed the bishop an example. A young man named Elijah, stitched with proverbs along his thighs, hands folded in prayer, eyes empty but posture perfect. The bishop did not flinch. He placed his palm on Elijah's head, murmured a blessing, and signed the guest ledger with a crimson seal. It was said he never spoke of the visit again. But years later, a sealed envelope in the Ely archives would reveal a brief entry from his personal journal. "God forgive what I witnessed, or grant it purpose I cannot see." The psychological effect of the scripture binding spread faster than infection. Patients began tracing verses on their own arms, scratching letters into thighs with broken nails, mouthing psalms in their sleep. Even those not selected grew quiet, fear of the needle became as strong as fear of the belt or the cell. Fenn encouraged this. He believed dread was the most efficient teacher. One woman sewed her own name into her arm using thread pulled from her bedding, hoping that branding herself would spare her selection. It didn't. She was bound anyway, this time with verses about vanity and false prophets. She died during the 4th session when the needle slipped and punctured a lung. Fenn recorded it as reactionary collapse. Her name was not marked in the burial log. The nurses obeyed without question, many no longer knowing why. They followed patterns, folded linen in thirds, counted the needles twice before returning them. Some whispered the verses as they worked, not from belief, but because silence made the walls ring with old bell sounds. A few nurses developed tremors. One carved a verse into her own belly during a night shift. She survived but was dismissed and relocated to a distant sanitarium where she was never named again. Her absence was not noted in any official file, but the thread she used was traced back to Renshaw. Fenn, in his own mind, had created a scripture of the body, a doctrine not of faith but of control, where the soul did not ascend but complied. He believed this was the evolution of penitence, not guilt, not forgiveness, just precision. Measured pain, controlled repetition, letters sewn to flesh spelling not redemption but surrender. And once a body surrendered, it no longer needed saving, it simply existed as proof. Long after the asylum closed and the records were scattered or destroyed, the chapel floor gave way to rot. A corner tile collapsed beneath a preservationist's boot in 1923, revealing a void beneath the altar. What they found wasn't a burial vault, nor any architectural feature recorded in the original plans. It was a chamber sealed behind oak and lime, its walls lined not with stone but with metal sheeting dull with age. The floor was uneven, flecked with rust and something black that flaked off at the touch. And at the center, bolted into the walls in vertical rows, were iron loops, too high to be used for restraint across a bed, too low to hold someone seated. Each ring had a length of chain attached, stained at the ends, most with old leather cuffs still attached. No beds, no benches. Just enough space to stand and not quite enough to kneel. They called it the quiet room. But the walls told another story. There were no windows. The chamber was too deep beneath the stone. But embedded into the walls, disguised at first by grime, were dozens of small brass vents, horn-shaped, with curled lips like listening ears. From the other side of those vents, old wiring trailed back toward the surface. Tracing them revealed they were connected not to the chapel's bell system, but to a sealed cabinet once hidden in the old vestry. Inside the cabinet were 7 metal canisters, labeled only by initials and dates, and a machine designed to play looped wax recordings. What played in that chamber was not silence. It was noise, methodical, deliberate, and never-ending. Dr. Fenn had designed the chamber as a final stage of obedience, a place not to isolate the body but to break the mind by replacing its rhythm. The recordings were taken from real patients. Cries, yes, but also apologies, pleas, prayers muttered under breath. One voice repeated the phrase, "I will listen now," over and over, its tone flattening with each cycle until it sounded more like breath than speech. Another whispered scripture, not read calmly, but screamed backward in panic and reassembled by the machine into eerie chants. Some were of sermons, distorted, layered beneath the crying so that belief and grief became indistinguishable. These sounds were fed into the quiet room's vents at varying intervals, sometimes in unison, sometimes staggered. The effect was that of being surrounded not by voices but by memory itself. Memory as infection, as weight, as something that could crawl into your ears and rewrite who you were. Patients were selected quietly. No records remain of how many entered, but the rust stains, the scratches on the metal and the letters carved into the stone walls, some in nails, some with teeth, tell enough. Those brought here were not allowed to sit. Chains were kept short to prevent rest. Blood pooled in their ankles. Backs stiffened. Some died still standing, the cuffs growing tighter as their limbs swelled. Their deaths were recorded as seizures, failures of the heart, spiritual overstimulation. But what truly killed them was repetition. Fenn believed that the soul could not resist truth when it was heard enough times. That if a lie could be broken into syllables and scattered into the ears of a broken body, the body would absorb it like scripture. One man lasted 12 days. He had been defiant before. Once tore a brass plate from the door frame with his bare hands. But in the quiet room his strength withered. He began to sob without tears, whispered forgiveness to things that had never happened. When his body gave out, his mouth remained open. They said he was still mouthing the words when they cut him down. Fenn documented none of this directly. He kept the quiet room's existence hidden, even from his most trusted nurses. But hints remained in his private journals. Phrases like auditory immersion trials, vertical confinement adaptation, and confession without touch. He wrote once, "When the mouth cannot lie, the ear becomes its judge. Truth must be forced through the canal like water through stone." He saw sound as sharper than blade, more precise than fire, and he believed the mind could be tuned like an instrument. Stripped of dissonance, reshaped by echo. When the chamber was discovered, the walls still rang faintly. Not loudly, just enough for those standing still to swear they heard something breathing behind the brass. The canisters were confiscated and destroyed. The room was filled in, bricked shut, the opening sealed under new stone. But those who had descended remembered. The curator who first stepped down died months later. Cause unknown, body found beside his phonograph, wax string tangled in his hands. Another suffered deafness in one ear without injury. He claimed it happened overnight after hearing someone whisper his name from inside a locked drawer. Fenn never wrote what he truly hoped to hear from those walls. But in one final page, smudged and nearly torn, he left a line that survives. They say silence is peace, but it is not. It is the place we send screams we wish to keep useful. Marion was born during thunder, or so the nurse's note claimed in the intake file. A sentence scrawled by a parish midwife with shaking ink and no last name. She arrived at Renshaw in late 1860, just before the snow froze shut the southern road. Her hair was too short, her feet too small, and her hands moved constantly, rubbing the corners of her sleeves, twitching along her skirt hem like she was counting something no one else could see. They said she would wake from sleep already screaming. That her mother died in the birthing bed and her father drank himself blind trying to forget the sound of her breath. No one came to visit. No one asked where she went. She was 12. Dr. Fenn reviewed her case in silence, letting the pages sit on his desk longer than usual. He studied her drawing, a house with no roof, a face with no mouth, a string of tiny black dots stretching across the paper like a trail of insects headed nowhere. He requested her personally, not for restoration, for observation. He believed her screams were pure, not shaped by society, not confused by guilt or sin. He called it raw vocal response. What Marion had was not madness in his eyes, but unfiltered humanity. That terrified him, and he needed to destroy it carefully. He placed her in the mirror ward, the salt basin, shallow, circular, cut from stone, sat beneath a flickering oil lamp designed to cast harsh shadows. The water was kept cold, laced with sea salt brought from the coast. Marion was stripped, soaked, submerged to the chin, and left for hours. Her arms were pinned under slatted wood. Her feet were left free, but her toes curled constantly as if trying to grip memory. She was not spoken to. She was not beaten. The only sound in the room was the slow drip of water through a copper pipe overhead, and the breath she fought to control. Above her, facing down at an angle she could not escape, was a warped mirror. It didn't reflect her clearly. It stretched her face into something alien. Forehead wide, chin too long, eyes sunk like holes in wet cloth. The more she screamed, the more grotesque her reflection became, and Fenn recorded all of it. Her screams were not sharp at first. They were animal sounds, breathy, unsure. But as the hours passed, they grew precise. A pattern formed. She screamed every 15 seconds for 2 hours straight, then silence, then breath, then weeping, then screams again. Fenn noted it as rhythmic response to internal disassociation. The girl had begun to hear herself outside her own body. She had split, and that was the point. By the 5th session, her voice was hoarse, but her eyes remained alert. Too alert. She stopped reacting to her reflection. She began humming between screams. She began laughing. Not in defiance, but in a strange, cracked rhythm, as though mocking a joke no one else could hear. She should have died in the 4th session. The salt had burned the soft tissue of her legs. Her lips were bleeding from dehydration. Her muscles had begun to seize. But she lived. And worse, she returned with memory. She spoke the number of drips between screams. She recited the height of the mirror. She asked once what the name of the man behind the glass was. The nurse who heard her dropped the feeding tray and never returned. Marion, against all expectations, would not break. She survived the 5th submersion. Fenn called her unexpectedly durable. He did not write her name again, but her voice remained. Fenn had captured every sound. He had it etched into wax cylinders. Marion's screams, looped and distorted, were fed into other chambers, played in the quiet room, layered beneath sermons in the chapel, mixed with the cries of other patients to form an auditory tapestry of despair. It wasn't just punishment. It was therapy. Patients who heard Marion's screams began to mimic them. One boy screamed every evening at 6 for 3 months straight. Another clawed out his eardrums during a session and wrote Marion's name in blood on the floor. Fenn called it progress. To him, Marion's suffering had become useful, not because she died, but because she hadn't. Her endurance was repurposed, her pain shared, and her voice, detached from her body, floated endlessly through the wings of Renshaw like a ghost that refused to be buried. The girl herself faded. She was no longer called Marion. Nurses referred to her as the Source. Her cell was isolated, soundproofed, and locked from the outside. She was not spoken to, not touched, not given mirrors. Yet she hummed, always hummed, even when her throat blistered. even when her tongue split from dryness, even when her hair fell out and her nails blackened. She still hummed, as if singing back the recordings played through the walls, as if she had learned to become an echo of herself. She died in winter, but no one recorded the day. Her body was found cold, stiff, mouth open, with no visible injury. Fenn called it respiratory dissociation. The truth was simpler. The girl who wouldn't die finally ran out of sound, and in the days that followed, the recordings played louder. By the early 1870s, Renshaw's outer walls had begun to turn black from ash, though no fires had been reported. The chapel's bell had not rung in years, yet the smoke rose steady from the rearmost flue, twisting into the sky even on windless mornings. At first, the townsfolk said nothing. For decades, they had learned not to speak too loudly of Renshaw, not to ask why some returned home altered and others not at all. But now, livestock began to vanish, not butchered, simply gone. Pigs, calves, stray dogs. The ground around the crematorium remained warm year-round, even in frost. And the air, especially near the far wall, had changed. No longer the sharp tang of medicine or vinegar, but a thick, sweet rot like sugared meat left too long in the sun. It was a silence no longer passive. It pulsed. And finally, someone noticed that the numbers no longer added up. A gravedigger named Tobias, who had worked the South Plot for over 30 years, began to ask questions. He was not brave. He was tired. His arthritis had slowed him, and the records he kept, hand-bound, brown with age, did not match what the asylum listed in its own book. On a winter afternoon, while checking for frost damage near the western tree line, he found a stone that had shifted. Beneath it, tucked into a crack in the foundation, was a wrapped oilskin ledger. No name on the front, just the faint outline of a stamped circle, the same one Dr. Fenn had once hung in place of the chapel cross. Inside were 67 entries, dates, initials, treatment codes, all marked concluded. None matched the 23 headstones above. Fenn had kept his final work hidden even from the staff. His cremations were not sanctioned by city ordinance, and the furnaces had been modified. Designed originally for medical waste, they had been rebuilt with deep-bore exhaust pipes and scorched tiles meant to absorb the thick oils that human remains left behind. Bodies were reduced not to ash but to slurry. Bone fragments softened, teeth fractured under slow pressure, and those that didn't burn entirely were collected and crushed beneath steel grates before being swept into lime pits. It was not disposal. It was ritual. Fenn believed the body should be unmade without memory. That ash with identity was a threat, that names, when spoken too long after breath, could reassemble ghosts. The names in the hidden ledger were initials only. But one caught Tobias's eye. MT, dated 3 years prior. He remembered burying a child by that name, a boy who had arrived after his mother was taken to Renshaw's East Wing. The grave he had marked was fresh. He'd placed a small stone himself. But the date in the ledger predated the grave by almost 2 weeks. And the child he buried had no teeth, all removed clean. No dental record on file. Fenn had claimed the body was damaged during birth. But Tobias remembered the boy's gums, smooth, red, raw, like they'd been burned open. It wasn't just one case. One by one, the entries began to speak. A patient marked JW was said to have died of fever, but there had been no quarantine at Renshaw that year. Another, labeled simply Subject 43, had a note beside it: incomplete ossuary sample, returned for final purge. Tobias copied it all, and when he brought it to the local registrar, he was told the asylum was not under parish control, that the Duke himself had sanctioned internal handling. That cremation of the mad was seen as merciful, clean, easier than the infection of inheritance. But Tobias had kept the teeth, a small box found behind the furnace room hidden in the wall. 32 molars, some blackened by fire, others pristine. No two alike, no record of dental removal. Just teeth, loose, waiting for names that no longer existed. He buried them himself in a box with no markings beside the chapel tree, and for the rest of his life he refused to speak near that soil. The ground, he claimed, still listened. Fenn never answered questions. The fire kept burning, the bodies kept vanishing, and the stone markers, already few, began to crumble. By the end of the decade, only 3 names remained legible in the asylum yard. The rest had been scraped, worn down by weather, nor by hands. Nothing provable, nothing direct. But the numbers said what the graves would not. 67 deaths, 23 stones, no crosses, and not a single full skeleton ever recovered. He arrived without escort, no horses, no trumpet, no announcement. Just a black coach at dawn, its wheels wet with dew and its driver silent as the gate swung open. The Duke of Sussex had not been seen in public for years. Rumors said he was ill, or mad, or dead. But the man who stepped out at Renshaw's front archway in 1875 looked neither weak nor confused. He looked resolved, thinner than remembered, hunched slightly, but with eyes sharper than anyone expected. He did not greet the staff. He did not request tea. He entered the chapel first alone and remained there for over an hour. No one dared disturb him. The fire in the altar's hearth had long gone cold, but the floor still bore the heat of something that had passed through. Not flame, but memory. When he emerged, his gloves were off and his hands were red with dust. He met no patients. He was offered none. Dr. Fenn did not walk him through the treatment wings. No reports were exchanged, no papers signed. Their meeting was private, sealed behind the vestry door, where the only light came from a coal lamp set low on the floor and a single circle etched into the center of the table, the same symbol that had once replaced the cross. What passed between them is not known, but when the Duke emerged again, he asked to see the tunnels, not the cellar, not the storage wing, the tunnels. The ones beneath the eastern ward that had no official record and no stairs that led to them. Only a single hatch disguised beneath the chapel tile and, rope ladder that disappeared into soot. 2 groundskeepers were ordered to open it. One refused and was dismissed on the spot. The other obeyed. Witnesses recall the smell that rose when the hatch opened. Something chemical, thick and wrong. Not sewage, not rot. Something older. The Duke descended without hesitation. Fenn followed. They were gone for 3 hours. When they returned, the Duke's boots were blackened and his eyes would not meet the light. He spoke no words, but he reached into his coat and removed a key. Long brass with teeth on both sides. He handed it to Fenn, turned once and climbed back into the coach. No one saw him again. What happened below remains theory, but the chapel furnace, which had gone cold that summer, was relit 2 days later. It burned hotter than before, with new coal deliveries arriving after dark, unlogged, paid in advance. The ash disposal doubled. Nurses were instructed not to approach the incinerator wing after dusk. Patients were moved away from the east wall, and in the weeks that followed, files began to vanish, not burned, removed, extracted with care. The ledger from 1862, the intake logs from the quiet room, the wax cylinder labeled MT-Vocal Sample 3, all gone. Then, without farewell, doctor, Fenn disappeared. It happened quietly. His bed was made, his gloves folded, his desk drawers empty. No resignation, no notice. The staff were told he'd accepted a post abroad, but no address was given, no forwarding instructions. His name was removed from the front gate. His journals vanished. The mirror ward was sealed, and the chapel door, once always unlocked, was bolted from within and never reopened. The brass symbol was taken down and buried behind the furnace wall, and still the fire burned. The Duke died the following year. His final statement, handwritten and locked in the Royal Archive, was not released until decades later. It read only, "The body must not remember what the fire did not finish. Some places must end before they are believed." No one from the royal family ever visited Renshaw again. The staff who remained were quiet, obedient, and transient. Many lasted less than a season. A few survived longer but left with tremors or burns they would not explain. And though Fenn's name was no longer spoken aloud, his systems remained. The chamber doors stayed locked, the machine still ticked behind the walls, and the furnace, always the furnace, continued to glow. Not because it was needed, but because it was never allowed to die.